Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Carrie McElwain, Chair of the Heartland Alliance Board, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to our virtual annual event. I hope everyone's not too zoomed out because I really think tonight's program will be an outstanding opportunity to engage and learn about one of the most important issues in our society, the destructive impact of systemic racism. Rising with Resilience is our theme tonight, and it's a fitting description of the dedication and determination our participants and staff have displayed throughout this incredibly challenging year. Heartland Alliance has been on the front lines, fighting the pandemic, helping the most vulnerable find safety and access to healthcare, legal services, and helping others bounce back after losing their jobs or housing. Throughout the pandemic, Heartland offered COVID testing and now providing vaccines to vulnerable people in shelters throughout the city. Thank you to the hundreds of frontline essential staff members who worked tirelessly this past year on behalf of our participants. So many of the issues our participants face are rooted in systemic racism and other forms of oppression. Tonight, we will engage in a thought-provoking discussion that will explore the destructive impact of racism and systems of oppression within society and among our participants. And we're going to talk about what we're doing to address this inequity. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors. It's my pleasure to recognize our presenting sponsor, Evelyn, and our platinum sponsors, Assurance, Crown Family Philanthropies, and JP Morgan Chase. And thank you to all of our sponsors and all of you tonight for supporting the Heartland Alliance. It's important to recognize tonight's premier sponsor, Capital One. Capital One is working to change banking for good by bringing humanity, ingenuity, and simplicity to banking. They, like Heartland, are working to close gaps in equity and opportunity by advocating for an inclusive society, building thriving communities, and creating financial tools that help enrich lives. They recently announced the Capital One Impact Initiative, a $200 million 5-year commitment to support growth in underserved communities and advance socioeconomic mobility. This commitment builds on the $60 million they invested in our community to advance social justice for Black communities and to address critical needs in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're incredibly grateful for their support tonight and their strong partnership throughout the year. Let's take a look at how Capital One is advancing socioeconomic mobility by creating financial tools that enrich lives, advocate for thriving, inclusive communities.
I was primed from the age maybe even 3 to 4 on playing the game. Many African American people will know exactly what I mean. At home, you act a certain way with your family, be yourself, but in public and at work and at school, you have to not be your authentic self. They were great survival tactics, but now I look back, it was kind of like a double-edged sword, if you will.
I can be my authentic self in a cafe. We're an all-Black staff too, and we're all so much different stories, different upbringings, different experiences. So I hope when people in the community see the installation, I hope they just get curious. Not just about Black History Month, but Black people. So I grew up in Egg Harbor City, New Jersey.
I grew up on the south side of Chicago in Inglewood.
And I will say we dealt with a lot. Poverty, violence, crime, drugs. One thing that was always consistent was the love.
I'm being serious now. The influence that my mom had on me is, I can't even come up with words. My mom had breast cancer. She's a breast cancer survivor. To see her go through chemo and come out of it and to still be there to support us, I can't thank her enough. She is literally the why behind why I do what I do, why I push so hard to be successful in my career. The philosophy I wish to live out day to day is simply leaving everybody better than I found them. I just want to impact everybody that comes in the door. It can be for me just making them smile. It can be for me helping them open up an account, just leaving them better than I found them, even if it's the little smallest change.
Giving back to the community and being an example, it is bringing light to the world for as long as we possibly can. And yeah, just being true to yourself and making the world better simply because you exist.
I grew up in Ghana, West Africa, I moved to the States when I was 17. Being raised in both places, I say is what's the best of both worlds. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, so I infuse my African roots, my Ghanaian roots, my culture, always knowing that that's the core of who I am.
What happens when you can't be authentic is you find yourself behaving in a way that pleases other people. I am writing my story this time. I've always let other people written it, but no more of that.
I hope people take away from the Black History Month installation is just, that the conversation does not stop. We all have a role to play in it. If you have a community of people, everybody brings something different to the table. And I think once you share those ideas, you will be moving forward towards something positive, some kind of change. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but eventually you will. So long as you keep that conversation going.
Thank you again, Capital One, for your deep support. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., Brandis Friedman, and Evelyn Diaz. Eddie Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Princeton University. Glaude is the author of several important books, including Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, which has been described as one of the most imaginative, daring books of the 21st century. His most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, was released this past June. Imani Perry describes the book as precisely the witness we need for our treacherous times. Glaude's also a columnist for Time magazine and a regular contributor on MSNBC. Brandis Friedman is an award-winning journalist. She's the co-anchor of WTTW's flagship news and public affairs program, Chicago Tonight. She's correspondent for WTTW News and host of their new weekly series, Black Voices, focusing on issues that matter to the Black community. Over her career, she's interviewed many history makers, from the Little Rock Nine to former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And the president of Heartland Alliance, Evelyn Diaz, who many in our audience know. She is an absolute rock star. 25-year career in nonprofit, government, and community service, fighting to bring social justice and programmatic changes to our city and our state. Last year, Evelyn committed Heartland Alliance to becoming explicitly anti-racist. It is her brave leadership that makes me so proud to be a part of Heartland Alliance. I have no doubt that you'll be inspired to act after hearing from our panelists. You'll see the impact that Heartland Alliance has made on so many lives. Help support Heartland Alliance. Help us build an anti-racist society. Please donate online, or you can text to give at HAGIVE to 71777. That's text HAGIVE to 7177 to show your support. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And as you've heard, my name is Brandis Friedman. Thank you for allowing me to join you. Thanks to Carrie McElwain, the Heartland Alliance board chair, and Heartland Alliance, of course. As you all know, Heartland Alliance is a human rights organization that works to restore social, economic, and racial justice to those who've been denied it through its advocacy and direct service efforts. One of the first stories that I did with the Heartland Alliance was a few years ago about its harm reduction program for people recovering from the devastation of opioid addiction. And not only does the program train participants on the use of naloxone to stop an overdose, or it also provides the Suboxone to people who are working to stop using opioids, or those who have already been able to do that. And we all know, within the last year, the increase in the opioid addiction and overdose, it's just one grim casualty of the pandemic, as people aren't able to seek the help that they would normally be able to get. And this past year has shown us that there are vast disparities, not just in healthcare and access to it, but also access to healthy environments. At Chicago Tonight, we are covering every aspect of this pandemic. And then last summer, we had an eruption of social justice protests after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. In response to that, we did a special on Chicago Tonight, or a special edition of Chicago Tonight called Peace and Justice, about systemic racism and the trauma that can come with being a Black American. We extended that to 2 new shows on the weekends, Chicago Tonight Voices, Latino Voices, and Chicago Tonight Black Voices, airing on weekends. Shameless plug. But we do that to share more stories about those communities. And these are many of the same communities where Heartland Alliance works. Because if you look at some of the protests on the streets, what people are saying, it is because those voices feel that they are not being heard. So we're going to talk about them a lot more today. On that note, we even had Dr. Glaude on Chicago Tonight Black Voices a few weeks ago to discuss this moment in our history and his book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. More on that in a moment. It was a treat to have him on our show then, and it's, of course, a treat to hear from him today, along with Evelyn Diaz, because it is clear that we are at a critical moment in our history. What are the odds that half a year after the start of what is being called our racial reckoning last summer, that we'd also witnessed the insurrection at our nation's capital during, a critical ritual of democracy when that was taking place? So I want to start with Professor Glaude, with you, if I can, because I just mentioned your book. And at the time that it came out, you started it, during the Trump administration. It came out, I think it was June of last summer. And so I want to know why you felt the need to write this book.
Well, first of all, it's so wonderful to be in conversation with you again, Brandis, and to be here with the Heartland Alliance and Sister Evelyn. But to answer your question directly, it was because I was in despair and disillusionment, And I was worried about those young activists in Ferguson, many of whom were dying, many of whom were struggling to figure out what they were going to do next. But I kept saying to myself, as I was thinking about, the 2016 election, I was like, oh my God, they did it. They've done it again. Look what the nation has done again. It has turned its back on us again. And I had been reading Baldwin, of course, and teaching Baldwin for close to 30 years. And I knew that he went through his moment of despair, although he said he wasn't despairing. That he went through a moment of despair and disillusionment after the assassination of Dr. King. And so I decided to return to his work, to return to what he called the ruins. And there I found Begin Again.
I want to hear a little bit more about that, because how does what Baldwin believed and wrote then, how does that reflect where we are right now?
I think that's a wonderful question. I mean, it takes us to the heart of the matter. Baldwin, to me, is America's most insightful writer about the vexing question of race and democracy. He takes up Ralph Waldo Emerson's preoccupation about who we are as a nation, right? What Emerson was writing about in The American Scholar or in the Harvard Divinity School address, Emerson's notion of American perfectionism, his idea of reaching for a higher self. Baldwin grabs Ralph Waldo Emerson by the collar and snatches him and brings him across the tracks to encounter what this place means in light of its central contradiction. What might this notion of whiteness mean for a nation who claims to be committed to democracy? How might it distort and disfigure the very people who embrace this idea that some ought to be valued more than others because of the color of their skin? And so Baldwin is thinking about this at the heart of his reflections on who we take ourselves to be, right? And in some ways, he's trying to grapple with why we refuse to tell ourselves the truth. And so there is this kind of perennial kind of preoccupation that animates his work that I think makes him relevant even today, right? Because he's dealing with the contradiction at the heart of the fragile experiment. And that is, what does it mean to imagine oneself as a democracy and yet hold the view that some people, because they're white, should be valued more than others, and then to distribute advantage and disadvantage along those lines. So that contradiction, which was at the heart of our founding in the context of slavery, is still a contradiction that haunts our democracy today.
And you've just touched on it, what you write about called the lie, basically, that the country has been telling itself since its foundation, and the value gap that you write about. A little bit more on the two of those things, please, for our audience.
Sure. So the value gap is this belief that white people matter more than others. And this belief shapes and informs our dispositions, our practices. It informs our social and political and economic arrangements. And it's the through line of American history. What the value gap will look like in the context of slavery will be very different than what it would look like in the context of us having our first black president, or even, our first black female president, a woman of color. What it draws our attention to is that, America is organized in such a way that certain people are valued more than others. And to the extent to which that's true, right, it compromises the very idea of liberty, our very idea of justice and the like. We can't, in some ways, become the kinds of people that democracies require, because we actually believe that some among us aren't as valued as others. And then we tell ourselves these stories about why that's the case. We justify that reality. Baldwin wrote a piece entitled "The White Problem" in 1964. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said, the people who founded the country had a fatal flaw. They saw themselves as Christian. They saw themselves as, founding a democracy, but they had chattel. And in order to justify the role these chattel were playing in their lives, they had to say that these were not men and women. Because if they weren't men and women, Brandis, then no crime would have been committed. And then here's the line that Baldwin says. He writes, he says, that lie is the basis of our present trouble. And the stories we tell about Black folks' capacities, the stories we tell about how they are less than, right? All of that is really a justification to in some ways reinforce this belief that some people, because of the color of their skin, should be valued more than others. So the lie is the general architecture that allows us to maintain a kind of willful ignorance or innocence in relation to the value gap that organizes our lives.
Is the country still telling itself this lie today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw it in real time, right? No matter what you think of the 1619 Project. I mean, I have my own historical quibbles with what the New York Times tried to do in Nicole Hannah-Jones, but I think, it's not an origin story. It's more, what happens if we begin here as opposed to there, right? If you begin with Jamestown in 1619, well, suddenly slavery becomes an issue. Indentured servants become an issue. Native peoples become a part of the story. The fact that America was a corporation before it was a country becomes part of the story. But more importantly, failure becomes part of the story. But almost immediately after, that the 1619 Project took off, we got the 1776 Commission, or the moment in which there's this reckoning around our public memory. What does it mean to memorialize with statues and honorifics, traitors? That is to say, generals from the Confederacy, those who actually betrayed their country. And what do we do with those who held slaves, who were a critical part of the founding of the country? Those sorts of reckoning, that's a different sort of question, but there's this sense in which we have to tell ourselves this story of America as the shining city on the hill, America as an example of democracy achieved, or the Redeemer Nation, because we actually believe, some of us at least, I think, hold the view that we lose our identity if we don't cleave to this notion. And so we continue to tell ourselves that lie. I think we need to tell ourselves a different story so we can imagine ourselves otherwise. That's what I think.
I want to pick up on that, and then I want to get Evelyn in here, because I obviously haven't forgotten about her. But how would we do that?
Well, we're beginning to do it. We saw it in the midst of, you mentioned in the lead that, we saw last summer all of these protests in the aftermath of the public murder of George Floyd. And folk were in the streets in the midst of a pandemic, risking their lives. And those protests morphed into these challenges to public memory. Think about Robert E. Lee's statue in Virginia, and what happened in Charleston, and Richmond, that is, and what happened in Charleston and the like, right? There was this challenge to how we narrate our story. I mean, it's one of the deep ironies that the country still, at least parts of the country, still celebrate those who threatened to tear the country apart in the name of slavery, And so we saw that reckoning, that battle. So part of the answer is that we have to tell a different story. We have to put forward alternatives about who we are. And 1619 Project is an example. Those protests in the streets were an example. The scholarship that some of us are trying to produce My own effort, I think, in Begin Again is a modest attempt at saying at least we should try to do something different. Think about what Brian Stevenson has done in Montgomery with the Legacy Museum and the quote-unquote lynching memorial, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It becomes this attempt to kind of confront the ugliness of who we are so that we can imagine ourselves differently. So.
Evelyn, I want to bring you in. We just heard, of course, about the history of our identity and who we are over this, since the foundation of the country, and how that led to the modern day, social, economic, and racial injustice that we all see today. And Heartland Alliance, of course, you all are a human rights organization that works to restore that justice. How is some of what we just heard from Dr. Glaude relevant to the work that the organization does now?
Yeah, well, thank you both for joining us for this conversation. I will tell you that the themes that came up in Begin Again are exactly why we invited Dr. Glaude and you to talk to us and our supporters. The lie wreaks havoc on our society, and that's the havoc that our staff swim in. In fact, everywhere Heartland Alliance works around the globe, people of color are routinely denied access to healthcare and jobs, housing and safety and economic opportunity. And it's our participants who bear the full brunt of that persistent deprivation. And it comes through in illness and trauma, homelessness and poverty, and just being forced to live in some of the most dangerous communities on the planet. And Chicago is a perfect case in point. We closed out 2020 with over 4,000 shooting victims and 769 homicides. We know that the majority of Black people in Chicago live in fear for their lives and the lives of their children. They live in segregated communities that lack good schools and jobs and grocery stores and banks, all the things that we know we need to secure our livelihoods and our futures. And this, I think, is the legacy of that deep-seated racism that James Baldwin warned of. And it's our city's shame. So our staff puts themselves right inside that reality to work alongside participants to help with basic human needs and help them, heal from complex trauma to rebuild their lives. And at the same time, we're tackling the systems that trap them in the first place. And yet, this summer, we take a look around and it just feels like the profound changes that we have really been striving for real equity and opportunity for all people is still so far away. So Dr. Glaude, through Begin Again and your TV appearances, you are helping millions of people see and understand the structures that have made these kinds of conditions inevitable. And by doing that, you put us all on a path to dismantling those structures and defining what an equitable and just society could be. And this is true of you too, Brandis, with your Black Voices show. Both of you are contributing to this new public discourse about race, and that creates an opportunity for Heartland Alliance to redouble our efforts and hopefully start to see some bigger traction, much more progress. So we're doing a lot of listening to experts like both of you. We're taking our strengths from your insights, and we're using those insights to examine ourselves and to examine the work that we do. And I would say, in fact, listening and learning is a huge part of our anti-racism commitment.
Thank you. And thank you, Evelyn, obviously, for your kind words. I consider myself far from an expert. I am still a student of all the things, honestly. But I want to follow up on one more thing with you, if I can, before bringing Dr. Glaude back on. But we talk about what is a big problem, right? We have had decades upon decades of inequity that leads to what so many people have finally been able to open their eyes to over this last year, is that inequity and what that means, how that affects the lives of so many Black and brown people in their everyday lives. And it's daunting. It sounds like a very big problem. And so I want to ask you, Evelyn, obviously one organization cannot solve all of the problems. And you give me a little bit of an impression of the work that you do. I mentioned, the harm reduction program earlier. We've done a lot of stories on your READY program for young men who have been previously incarcerated. And so I guess I want to know, how do you approach addressing these many, many problems across the communities?
Typically we just start with we start with the population, and we find out what it is that they need. I agree with you that we can't do this by ourselves, and working with other organizations, working in solidarity with similar organizations who have similar advocacy agendas has been part of how we do our work. We're going to be doing much more of that as well, I think. And but we start with, what's the core problem and why can't we solve this? The Ready Chicago program is a perfect example of this, where we have this gun violence problem in Chicago, and we're aware of how our city had been approaching it up until we designed Ready. And Ready was designed to identify the men who were doing the shooting and being victimized by the shooting, and go to them and knock on their doors and meet them and talk to them and know them, and reach out to them instead of with a law enforcement solution, instead with a solution that was about jobs and getting support for their lives. And we've since served 700 men. The evaluation results are incredibly promising. We're reducing shootings and homicides. But more importantly, we've reached a segment of the population that society has cast off. These are mostly Black men who society has written off, and we found them, and we found a way to engage them and to see their potential and to invest in it. And so most of our work historically has been about trying to solve problems by going to the people most affected by them and seeing them.
Dr. Glaude, one of the things that Evelyn mentioned a little while ago was, the importance of listening. And I remember last summer when the reckoning began, so many people were like, I'm going to read all these books and I'm going to educate myself and I'm going to learn. I don't know how those book lists are doing today. It's been some time. They probably want to add Begin Again to the list. But I wanted to just get your thoughts, on this moment, because it feels like we are at a moment where we could begin again. So I want to get your impression, knowing what's happened since your book was published. Are we at the right place now, or are we at a place where we can begin again?
It's a hard question to answer because I'm not sure yet. It all depends on what we do. For some, the election in November, was a moment to affirm America's goodness. People wanted to turn the page really quickly and return to some sense of normalcy before whatever happened over the last 4+ years happened. And what was before Donald Trump, of course, was a society deeply stratified. Black Lives Matter was still happening. Police were still doing what they were doing to Black folk around the country. Deep divisions. COVID-19 didn't cause the disparities that we're seeing. It actually revealed them. So we were a society in deep trouble prior to the last administration. And so where we are now is a kind of a demand for us to kind of honestly assess, what we need to do at a certain scale, at a certain level of scale, to respond to the problems we face, because our society is broken. It may be unfinished, as Amanda Gorham says, but it is broken. It's almost as if the social contract, the moral contract we supposedly have made with each other has been shredded. And what I heard Evelyn talking about with finding those men that have been cast away was the kind of elements of a kind of public infrastructure of care. So we're at a moment where the nation can't imagine itself otherwise. But historically, when we've been at this kind of blues crossroads, Brandis, we haven't done very well. We've doubled down on our ugliness. So it all depends on us. It all depends on us in this moment.
Is that frightening at all to consider? Like you said, when we've been at these crossroads before, you say we haven't done very well. And if we are there again and history repeats itself, do you think we'll do better this time?
Well, I pray that we do. I use these, there are two historical coordinates that come to mind, right? One, of course, is the Civil War and radical Reconstruction. Historians call it the second founding. I write about this in the book. And, it's the period of the founding of the modern U.S. nation state, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? Deepening our conception of due process, untethering, at least ideally, our notion of citizenship from any idea of race. And what did we get in response, right? If Abraham Lincoln wasn't assassinated, he was going to welcome the South back to the Union. They just simply had to declare their allegiance. Andrew Johnson, the drunkard who took over, wanted to welcome them back and allow white supremacy to return. What did we get in response to radical Reconstruction? We got Jim Crow. Frederick Douglass lived long enough to see Abraham Lincoln sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and the state of Mississippi passed the first Jim Crow law. We got convict leasing, another form of slavery, where the state used police power to conscript black labor in order to build cities like Birmingham. We got ideology of Anglo-Saxonism. At the moment in which the nation was trying to imagine itself as a genuinely multiracial democracy, we doubled down on our ugliness, that this must be a white nation in the vein of old Europe. We did the same thing in the mid-20th century. In response to the Black freedom struggle, which was historians called the Second Reconstruction, we had calls for law and order, the tax revolt in California, elected Richard Nixon twice and Ronald Reagan to undo it all. At that moment, when we were trying to imagine ourselves otherwise, we doubled down on our ugliness. And here we are, January 6th has to be read as an extension of that moment, of those moments, an attempt to double down on the ugliness. But it's not fated to be the case. It all depends on what we do. It's in our hands. So I can't say for sure that we will fail, but I can't say we will succeed either. It's up to us. It's in our hands.
If only you had a crystal ball. And because you mentioned Mississippi, I have to point out it's both your home state and mine.
Indeed. Metaphor for America.
Yes. So, Evelyn, obviously, Heartland Alliance, you all have been doing the racial equity work to some degree for a very long time. And, things keep changing, we hope. For example, we know the Governor Pritzker has recently signed a sweeping criminal justice reform bill. What would you say is different now? And how will the work be different going forward after all that's happened?
Yeah. I mean, just to the question you just posed to Dr. Glaude, I'm optimistic, not that we solve it once and for all, but that we have an opportunity to really make much more progress than we've seen in other moments in history. It is, of course, up to us. And Heartland Alliance, we have been fighting against oppression and deprivation for people of color for 130 years. In that time, we've designed programs and advocacy campaigns. We've published studies and reports on how racism creates and sustains poverty, particularly for Black and Brown people. So really what's different now is that we're just raising the bar. We are exploring how much bolder and how much more effective we can be by making anti-racism core to our identity. This gets to this notion in Dr. Glaude's book about who are we? And if you start from a place about who we are as anti-racist, it illuminates a different path forward. And so we're looking at that. We're exploring that path. And it really starts with holding up a mirror to ourselves. So inside of Heartland Alliance, our Anti-Racism Council is leading a full-bore listening, learning, planning effort, looking at everything inside the organization, from power and place, how we make decisions and hiring and advancement, how we do professional development and training. They're looking at total culture change. And exactly nothing about that is easy. It takes a lot of courage for our staff to say, we're going to step into discomfort. with no end date, because our commitment to equity and opportunity is bigger than our fear of our discomfort. And so that's what we're doing inside. And then in our community work, we're prioritizing new program innovation and policy change that's intentionally designed to advance racial equity and justice. So that includes things like new approaches to reduce shootings and homicides in Chicago, creating housing options for people with criminal records, closing the racial wealth gap. We've identified and cataloged 1,300 statutory barriers in Illinois for people with criminal records. We want to eliminate those in one fell swoop. And we're just going to keep asking ourselves, what more can we do? So I'm curious to hear from you, Dr. Glaude, what more can organizations like Heartland Alliance do? What can our friends and supporters who are listening do to advance racial equity and dismantle systemic racism? It is up to us. What's next? What can we do?
Well, it's a very good question. And, part of what I see my role as is in some ways trying to help us with a different kind of frame, right? And, it's not just simply about loud racist people screaming ugly things and the like. It's about understanding that racial equity and justice isn't a philanthropic enterprise, that the pursuit of those things isn't a charitable gesture, that it ought to be considered a constitutive value of who we take ourselves to be. And I think what we have to do, I want to go back to something I mentioned very quickly to Brandis, and I think it's consistent with what you all are doing at Heartland. And that is that we need a new moral and social contract. We need to announce our obligations to each other. What are the baseline agreements that every American should have, right? And I used this phrase earlier about a public infrastructure of care. And that public infrastructure of care should say, if you're in the richest nation in the country, if you get sick, our obligation to each other is that you're going to get health care. You're not going to go broke because you're sick. That's because we have a contract with each other. Our contract with each other should say, if you are working 40 hours a week, and you should make a living wage, you should be able to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head. Now, mind you, you should get health care no matter the color of your skin, no matter your zip code, no matter how much money you make. If you are entering in a labor market, you're working hard 40 hours a week, right? You shouldn't have differential pay. You should receive an income, a living wage that will allow you to not only dream dreams, but to make those dreams a reality, as John Dewey says in Democracy and Education. And you mentioned a phrase earlier, Evelyn. I think alongside of healthcare as a value, living wage as a value, we should commit ourselves to every community being safe and secure. Not throw away this phrase of law and order, right? Which has led to increased policing and increased carcerality. But we want to say safety is a broader conversation. Security is a broader conversation that takes us into social services, takes us to education and job training and the like. Now, why do I bring this up in a conversation about racial equity? Because I'm asking us to get clear on what our idea of a just society actually is. If racial justice, racial equity is not a philanthropic enterprise, it's not a charitable gesture where you do one-offs. We need to be clear, if we're going to do this work, on what we mean by a just society. And that means for everybody. And so I would begin towards an answer to your question, Evelyn, by saying, let's commit ourselves to a new moral and social contract, and let's evidence that in a public infrastructure of care, in which no matter the color of your skin, no matter your zip code, no matter who you love, no matter your gender, no matter your ability, you can not only dream dreams in this country, you can make those dreams a reality.
And it's true what you say, that if that contract doesn't exist as a declared commitment, a written commitment, I would say, right, then it doesn't really exist, right? It's like it disappears. And so people can interpret it differently, and they can take their time with it, or they can do it partially, or they can interpret it in different ways. And so it really resonates with me that that what needs to happen is a new set of agreements, and how we do that as a nation, how we do that locally is, it remains to be seen. But it's something that we definitely want to go deeper into. I think, Brandis, I have a question for you too, which is that we seem to be at this turning point culturally, right? With all this kind of this dialogue that we're having. How can we keep these kinds of conversations, like the ones that you have on your show, how can we keep them going? Just as they're a matter of our national discourse. Like, we do a really good job of reporting on the weather every day. Could we have reports on social equity issues like we report on the weather? Can it just be part of, again, who we are?
I would love to do that. I would love to be able to report on social justice issues the way we report on the weather. But yes, I think it warrants more conversation from all of us. I think one of the concerns was, once we kind of went back to some sense of, pandemic normalcy last year and even now, is it something that people they just kind of move on with their lives and they don't have to think about this anymore because it's not on the news confronting them the way it did last summer. And so that's part of why we started Black Voices, was because, if you see and hear people out there, protesting in the street, it is because they felt like they were not being heard, that their voices, their stories weren't being heard. And that has been made evident in so many other ways outside of a protest. So for me, I go to the work, and it is what I try to do every day with the stories I tell on Black Voices, but also on Chicago Tonight throughout the week. And we had been doing that before as well. But I think Black Voices really gave us, and Latino Voices as well, really both of those shows give us the opportunity to really focus up on those stories. And it's also important that I think we look at that our history in Chicago's history is rich, and how that history provides the context for where we are right now today. At the same time, of course, we have to keep marching forward. And so that's what I mean. That's what I do every day is I try to keep that conversation going. And I keep doing the best I can. How everybody else keeps the conversation going, I don't know why they're not already talking about it, because I talk about it all the time. So I hope that through the work that you all are doing, you're able to engage more people for that work.
Sure. I mean, we've said that listening and learning is a good first step. And as you know, we have many listeners attending tonight, and I just want to, most of them, because I know many of them, they show up because they want to know what more they can do. So, we've said listening and learning and sharing resources. So just, we have a lot to learn. We have to become students again, in some ways. But some people in the audience are also in positions of power. They run corporations and they run big foundations. And so to either of you, what comes to mind as a message to the folks who can do more than just listen and learn, but have resources and ability to help us advance this conversation, help us achieve some of our system change goals, and create this new social contract? Dr. Glaude, do you have ideas about that?
I've been thinking about it a little bit, Evelyn, but you want to stay in your lane. I don't want to suggest that I can think of, have advice for folks who are doing this stuff on the front lines and the like. But I do know this: we can't tinker around the edges. We're in a moment now where we have to shift the ground beneath our feet. We have to step outside of our comfort zones. I don't know if this is not hyperbole either. I don't know if the country can survive if we make the wrong choices in this moment. So I would say to companies, right? Imagine your moonshot. Let's not just simply do D&I. Let's really think about it as a core constitutive value of how you go about doing your work. American businesses cannot succeed if they keep sidelining such a large percentage of its talent. We know the data is clear about what diverse leadership teams produce, what a diverse room, how a diverse room is bolder, more creative, more visionary in terms of the problem solving. We need to get everybody on the field. We also need to leverage our power. Foundations and corporations need to leverage their power in terms of folk who they do business with. We need to begin to share our successes. I've been trying to do this with Princeton with John Rogers and others, right? Look, not only do you have to do business, Princeton, with minority firms, you have to ask the other firms that you do business with, who are they doing business with? We need to change how we do our work at every level. Because at the end of the day, Evelyn, we have to figure out how we're going to be together differently, because it hasn't worked up until now. And so we're at that moment. We can't tinker around the edges. We have to be bold. And those are just a couple of suggestions of how we might be bold.
All right. Well, this has been a very informing and inspiring conversation. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of it. And Evelyn Diaz, Professor Eddie Glaude, thanks to you both for sharing your knowledge and your thoughts today.
Thanks so much, Brandis. Thanks, Dr. Glaude. Just a pleasure.
Thank you all.
My name is Charlotte Cannon. The reason why I like Inglewood, when I first moved in here, everybody was lovely and neighborly and watching out for one another. I'm over here in the Inglewood area and I have to go way out to Cook County Hospital to get my attention when I should have some services right in the same area.
I have been here in the United States for 4 years. I was a little afraid starting the whole life from the beginning. Everything was very new, and I was kind of hopeless to finding a job, and I didn't feel like I'm gonna make it.
I'm actually from the west side and the south side of Chicago. Well, gun violence in my neighborhood is like very normal. Like you hear gunshots like mostly probably every day. When I first experienced gun violence, I was probably like 14. When I was 18, I was fighting for my life. I was in prison. At that point, I felt like did nobody give me a chance. I just felt like they tried to throw me away.
When I came into the Heartland Alliance Clinic, they would greet you and they would say, "Good morning, Miss Cannon, how you doing?" And I say, "I'm doing fine." The people at the Heartland Alliance Clinic just made me feel excellent, make me feel wanted, loved. That's how they made me feel.
And I was kind of hopeless to finding a job. Then I found Heartland Alliance. Then said, "Oh, you might be able to work in the hotel industry." And that's when I went there and started taking the training. I finished my training. It took us like 4 or 5 weeks, and hopefully I'll be the manager one day. I'm very proud of it because I have made a lot of progress in the last 3 years.
It made me feel great. It made me feel like a superstar winner, knowing that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and like I told myself I will do. The most important thing I got already is being reliable as far as coming to work every day, like integrity, standing on what I tell them I'm gonna stand on, and being committed, because this is my job. Like I gotta get out here every day and do what I say I was gonna do on the workforce and in the classroom.
Health and healing.
Safety and justice.
Economic opportunity.
Hello again. What an amazing conversation. The fascinating perspectives from Dr. Glaude, Evelyn, and Brandis were thought-provoking and a prime example of why I support Heartland Alliance and their work to restore social, economic, and racial justice to those who've been denied it. I hope that each of you feel inspired to contribute to dismantling the structural barriers that foster racism and contribute to the issues our participants face. If Jamel, Charlotte, and the Teak story moved you, please donate online now or text HAGIVE to 71777. Your support will make a huge difference. It provides the critical resources people need to overcome trauma, poverty, and violence. And your support also demonstrates the power we all have to change oppressive systems that deny access to equal rights and representation for communities of color. I'm asking you to join us in championing human rights and promoting equity and opportunity for all.
For those who've already given, thank you for your generous contributions. And for those planning to give, I'd like to share my gratitude in advance. Once again, I hope the conversation and the stories that have been shared throughout this program have inspired your commitment and piqued your interest in new ways. Thank you to all of our important sponsors who allow us to continue to do this life-changing work. And finally, on behalf of Heartland Alliance's leadership, our governing boards, our auxiliaries, and our staff, thank you again to our guests for sharing their insights, and thank you to all of you for joining us and sharing your time. Let us join together and rise with resilience on our journey to achieve equity and opportunity for all.